Ave later. There we go. So, oh, and here she is. All right, so this week we are studying Chayei Sarah, Genesis 23 through 25. What's the end cap? I should write this down before we start. Yeah, 23 to 25:18. Okay. So, all right. So it starts with Sarah's death. There's some interesting stuff that happens in the Hebrew there that we can dive into, but just to give the recap first. So it opens with Sarah's death. Abraham buys a cave to bury her in. He's really insistent that he wants to pay for the cave, that he wants to own that piece of land in the Holy Land. And eventually that cave is then where he's also buried, and Jacob's body is brought back there from Egypt. Leah's buried there. I missed a generation. Rebecca and Isaac are buried there. Rachel is not because she dies on the road to Bethlehem, or from Bethlehem. So, but all the other matriarchs and patriarchs are buried there, and there is a tomb in Hebron that is identified as this cave. Okay, so after Abraham buries his wife, he immediately turns around and says, "Oh no, Isaac has lost his mommy. Now he needs a wife because who else will cook for him, right? That's what women do." So he sends his servant Eliezer out to back to his homeland to find a wife from their like home clan or whatever for Isaac. And Eliezer, of course, he goes to the well first because that's like the local, bar. That's the pickup scene. And he says to himself, like, how will I know which of these fair maidens at the well are suitable for Isaac? God will give me a sign. The one who is so generous that not only gives me some water, a weary traveler, but also waters all my camels. That's how I'll know she's the one for Isaac. So of course, Rebecca does this. It takes 4 trips back and forth from the well because camels drink a lot. And then as soon as she does this, Eliezer presents her with like the betrothal bracelets, the bangles, and she is so excited and she runs home and tells her family. And we meet Laban, who becomes more of a character later as the father of Leah and Rachel, but here he's just kind of like vaguely territorial of his sister. He like has more to say about this betrothal than their father, which is kind of interesting. But Rebecca insists she's gonna go, so she rides back with Eliezer back to the Holy Land. And as soon as she sees Isaac, she's so in love. She covers her face so you won't see her blushing. And then it ends. That section ends with they go into Sarah's tent for their wedding night. Also interesting. And then at the end of the Parsha as a whole, Abraham dies, and both of his children gather to bury him. So that's the summary. There's like, this also, remember, comes right on the heels of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac. And there is a lot of midrash about how all of this connects together. And it's just a really interesting section of Torah narrative that we can dig into many aspects of. So I want to open up the floor and see what jumped out at any of you to start with.
Yes.
No? Well,
I'm sorry, Rabbi. Somebody was asking for the passcode for the Torah. She said she had the link, but it asked for the passcode. I sent it to her just now,
Okay.
whoever it was. I don't know who it was. So I apologize for not
Must be
following.
Juliet, because here she is. Hi, Juliet. Good to see you in real time. Maybe she can't hear me. It says connected audio. Okay.
Hi,
Anyway.
Juliet.
So Julia, we just finished the summary of the Parashat, and I was asking if anyone has a particular piece they want to dive into first.
This portion just seemed pretty straightforward, and it was just the story of, and they repeated the story of the meeting several times to each other, and then it was interesting that at first the family didn't want to let her go right away, let us say goodbye for 10 days, but then they asked for her opinion on the matter, and I thought that was very 21st century.
Yeah. Rebecca's a very strong character. A very strong woman for her time. And we'll see more of that, as she becomes a mother, but she's assertive in this parsha. As far as straightforward goes, nothing in the Torah is really straightforward. But but sure, the narrative, there's not a lot of confusion in the Parashat, but there's always more to dig in. So I'll make a plug here for our Haberman Institute partnership. That speech is about, or that lecture is about Moses, so it's not about this section, but that scholar, Aviva Zornberg, you may recognize her name because I've brought her up a few times in Torah Study. I'm a big fan. And her chapter from her book of Genesis, her chapter on this section is really interesting about how, Rebecca is a woman of light. She's generous. She's trusting. She's so willing to go with this stranger. She's, she goes through life really with her heart open. And it seems that, maybe she hasn't really experienced a lot of hardship up until her difficult pregnancy, that she's just really ready for whatever. And then we have Isaac, who is deeply traumatized. He's a man of darkness. His name means laughter, but he never laughs in his life. And so they're very good for each other. They balance each other out. They're that yin and yang. And I forget now exactly, it's been a while since I read that book, but she describes that that's part of why Rebecca covers her face, that it's the first time she's seeing this dark, mysterious, handsome man. And it's not just blushing at his good looks or at the, love at first sight, which is what the traditional rabbis say. But Zornberg says it's she, Rebecca immediately senses in Isaac this kind of dark reality that she's never really experienced before, and she's kind of taken aback by it. And that's why she's suddenly very shy and trepidatious. So that's why she covers her face. Yeah, Joel.
So there is something of interest that supports what you said. I'm at 24:22. So of course, Rebecca waters the camels. Then Eliezer gives her the gold ring in her nose and the bracelets. Number 3, she said, "Oh, whose daughter are you?" Now, remember that order. When we skip down to 47, they're about to have a meal. He says, "Look, before we have the meal, let me tell you what just happened." And he gives the same story. So now the camels are watered. Number 2, he says, "Oh, then I asked her, whose daughter are you?" Number 3, I gave her the bracelet. In other words, there's a little change in the narrative. So of course, anyway, Do you have any commentary on that, or are you familiar with that?
It didn't really occur to me, but my guess would be that, like, my initial instinct, I see Rashi has something to say about it. We can look at that in a second, but my initial instinct would be, um, in real time, his main concern is that she's generous, and kind and whatever. So he's like, that's good enough for me. He puts the bangles on her. And then he's like, oh, also, like, who's your family? That's kind of important in this time and place. But then when he's retelling the story to the family, he remembers that that's like actually pretty important. And so he puts that inquiry before, the betrothal offer. That would be my instinct. So let's see, what does Rashi say? Yeah, Rashi says, how could you give her anything when you did not yet know who she was? So yeah, Rashi says similar.
Would the area that he was in pretty much negate the possibility that she would have been some of the people that he swore not to get? I mean, he could tell from various signs that she wasn't whoever Abraham asked her not to get a Canaanite. So he could.
Well, yeah,
tell she
because he's
wasn't
out
a
of Canaan at this point.
Okay. Oh, okay. So
he's gone north back to where he came from.
So you're right. He did what he had to. So he did what he had to do, but then he thought better of it that he should. Yeah. Find out. Jessica, did you have your hand up a minute ago?
Oh, sorry. Did I miss that?
No, it's okay. I just didn't want us to go a different direction if we weren't finished with this thought. Is that okay?
Are there other thoughts on this before we move on? All right, go for it.
Hi, folks. I'm the new kid on the block. My immediate, what kind of stood out was the fact that Isaac and, oh my gosh, I'm blanking, and Ishmael buried their dad together. And I just thought that was interesting just because there was so much conflict between Sarah and Hagar. And I just wonder if that conflict trickled down to the relationship with their brothers, because I just read it as a united front, like, this is our dad, we're burying him together. So just wondering about the relationship with the brothers.
Yeah, so that's another source of a lot of midrash of rabbinic stories. So I think like the most common traditionalist approach is that they come together to, as a sign of respect to bury their father. But there is also a midrash that I learned like relatively recently, last year at High Holy Day time, maybe even, that after the binding of Isaac, which kills Sarah, right? That's a very common classical midrash, that the knowledge of what happened on Mount Moriah is what causes her death. And so after that, like, his mother's dead. He can't stand to live with his father, who just tried to kill him. So Isaac goes to live with Hagar and Ishmael. And there's some clues there about like, so after the Akedah, Abraham goes back to Hebron. It doesn't say where Isaac goes. Back when Hagar, I guess is still only last week, but it's the beginning of the Parsha. So much happens in this section, but when Hagar and Ishmael are kicked out officially, they settle near Beer Lahai Roi, the well. And then it says in this, like, it's to the south or whatever. And then in this section, when it says, Isaac is coming in from the fields, he's coming from that direction when he and Rebecca first see each other. He's not coming from Hebron. So that's like, those clues and stuff are put together to suggest that, and early in their narrative, when they're children, it says that Isaac and Ishmael play together, and it makes Sarah upset. And so the rabbinic, the traditional approach to that is, well, they're playing a dangerous game, and Ishmael is taunting his little brother, and he's, they describe a game, one of the midrashim describe a game like the William Tell, whatever, like Isaac's got an apple on his head, and Ishmael's shooting
Yeah.
arrows at him.
Yeah.
And so that's what freaks, Sarah out. But it doesn't say, it just said, the Torah just says they're hanging out. They're having fun together. So we don't have any real reason from the text itself to believe that the boys have any animosity with each other. So yeah.
I guess another thing that struck me was that there was more description of the servant meeting Rebecca than there was of Isaac meeting Rebecca. And it didn't say, I mean, it said afterwards if he took her as his wife and loved her, but it doesn't say anything about the meeting except that what she did.
Yes.
I mean,
Isaac
up
doesn't
until
say
now, we
much.
didn't even know that he knew that Abraham had asked his servant to go find a wife. It seemed like it would have been a surprise to him or something.
Yeah, especially if he's not even living at home. If he is living with his brother and Hagar. So yeah, but we see even in the relationship, this is the only no, I guess we know that Jacob loves Rachel, but it's a rare instance in the Tanakh when we are told like there is explicit love between a couple. So we have to assume that there's something, but we even later, like when they are married, he like never says much, he just isn't a talker. When she's having her difficult pregnancy, and she asks him for like comfort, to intercede to God on her behalf or whatever, he kind of just brushes her off. I think Isaac is just very like he's very like go with the flow ish, that he just doesn't act. I mean, we see that even in the Akedah too. Like he asks his dad, here's the wood and here's the flint, but where is the sacrifice? And he just goes with it. I think Isaac doesn't ask a lot of deep questions. He just accepts reality for what it is, good and bad.
I thought it was interesting that Isaac was 40 years old when he got married, and I just, for some reason, I just had this perception that marriage happened a lot younger back then. So I don't know if that's a thing.
Yeah, time, ages, time span, whatever, in the Bible is wonky, right? Like if Isaac was conceived when his parents were in their 90s, 40 is still quite young. A man can definitely have children at 40, no problem. And it's believed that Rebecca certainly is much younger, like according to some midrashim, like disturbingly younger for Isaac, but at least, and I don't know, they do the genealogy somehow, but I'm not good at numbers, and I get lost in that building of of the generations, but they determine how old they think Rebecca is. And she's certainly of an age that we would expect marriage to happen at that time, 14 or something. Yeah, Joel, I see your comment there, but I don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything inherent in the word sachak to suggest danger. um, of Sarah's concern. You know, so laughter, play. So it's all in how you read it. We also learn in this parsha that Abraham marries again after Sarah dies, a woman named Keturah, which Midrash suggests might still be Hagar by a new name. I think that's interesting. When I lived in Israel, I lived on Kibbutz Keturah, so I have a space in my heart for her, even though we know like nothing about her. Or her children for that matter. I guess the Midianites do come up again significantly, but none of these others really do. So when there's a distinction in how the Torah tells us the age of Abraham and the age of Sarah when they die. Abraham's is much more straightforward. These were the years of Abraham when he died. And then it tells us, oh, it repeats too, I guess. It's so they repeat the word shana a lot. They don't just say, me'at shivim v'chamesh shanim. It's 100 years and 70 years and 5 years. Rashi offers different commentary on this for Sarah and for Abraham. So for Abraham, he says, it's written out like this because even though he was 100, or at the age of 100, he was as strong as 70, and at the age of 70, he was as innocent as a 5-year-old. So that's why each digit is separated out like that. And for Sarah, it's because every single year of her life was so filled with chesed that it requires really honoring every year. So hers says 100 years and 20 years and 70 years. 7. Did I say 70? 7. 127. Yeah. Anyway. So there's that. Other thoughts? I'm often, oh, sorry, yeah.
I just was still thinking about, I guess it was in a previous portion, but we were talking about Ishmael and Isaac playing together, and it could just simply be that Sarah had such an antipathy for Hagar and Ishmael that she didn't want her son to be his friend. She didn't want any relationship there to blossom of any kind because she disliked them so much.
Yeah, that's sort of my feeling about it, is that Sarah's worried about Ishmael's claim as heir, as the older brother, and that if the boys, if we give too much attention to Ishmael, if the boys are friends and Isaac has sympathy for Ishmael's situation, whatever, it's not just like she wants Ishmael to be miserable and not have friends, but it's just more like she feels threatened generally by his existence and doesn't want her son to legitimize Ishmael's role in the family. That's what I think. That's my reading of it. And I think Sarah's I think she's a complicated woman, and I don't mean to point out an ungenerous spirit in that one instance when we know she does have the capacity to be incredibly generous and welcoming, as we see when they welcome in the strangers at their tent and she makes this great feast, and um, you know, and as they're making their way in the beginning of Lech Lecha, when they're coming down from Haran to Canaan, and it says like they gather, Abraham and Sarah both gather souls with them along the way. Like they're so welcoming and kind and whatever, that they just like amass this following, and like I think there is something to be said in Sarah's character as we see it develop about um how we judge like when to be hospitable and when to gatekeep. And um although I disagree with her treatment of Hagar and her reasoning for that treatment, I do understand that like there is a time for boundaries and for establishing like who's in the community and who's not. And that, you can't necessarily be endlessly welcoming, or like the nature of the community changes and then it will inevitably push other people out. And so like I do think that I have a lot of sympathy for her choices and behavior, even when some of them are a little too mean for my taste. But like I think there's a lot of purpose behind it for her in a way that's like not necessarily, power hungry or whatever for herself, as we see some other characters later in the Bible illustrate.
Well, and it's sort of like a prequel to so many cases, both in real history and in fiction, of this kind of family tension between the who has the right to the inheritance, so to speak. It's you see
Right.
that over and over and over again.
Yeah. I was thinking about that this week, but now I don't remember what new realization occurred to me. But there was something about um the different the inversions of inheritance that we see again and again um in the Bible. Yeah, Joel.
Okay, when I look at it, so here's Abraham and Sarah. They have a kid. Now, Hagar is not Abraham's wife.
Right.
Hagar means the stranger. Her provenance is from Mitzrayim. She is, in fact, an Egyptian. So therefore, she is really a descendant of Ham. Noah had the three children, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So in other words, this tradition of ours really belongs to Shem. That's why we're called Semitic, the word Shem. I did notice something interesting. They did talk about Rebecca, and they describe her right away as Betula. And a long time ago, I just caught right onto that and said, I'm going to pay attention to the Hebrew as we go through the 5 books of Moses. And I did not find other women described in that way during that time. And then I did notice that her father is Betuel. So here's Betula, Betuel. Now, many of the names throughout the 5 books of Moses are eponyms, E-P-O-N-Y-M, meaning the name that we call them is kind of who they are, actually like us today too. So I've been working with this for actually a number of years, and it occurred to me a few days ago I also have, do people know about the Wellhausen theory? Wellhausen?
No.
It's around 200 years old, and this is one of our friends, one of the Christian scholars, and he determined that the Bible wasn't given in one shot at Mount Sinai. Maybe it was given metaphorically, but it was really added to and edited and changed maybe by 200 people. That's called Wellhausen theory. There's a very good book called Who Wrote the Bible? Richard Elliott Friedman. It's a short book, and that really describes the whole thing. How people throughout history, by the way, this happens with the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. This is how works are developed. So I do have a color-coded 5 books of Moses, and I was looking up Betuel, and I said, well, wait a minute, when did someone kind of add that in? Now, the original story about Rivka was shortly after the exile, 586 BCE. Yet the story about Betuel was all added in around the 3rd century BC. So here we're talking 200, 300, 400 years. So another, I'm trying to substantiate that our Torah is the absolute truth, the way it's been put together. And of course, other people are going to say, oh no, you guys changed it. We say, oh no, you guys changed it. So when I look at it in a very, very thorough way, I have to say it is emet, meaning truth. And I've just encountered that. And it's just, it's a very feel-good type of knowledge to come across. So I have a lot of trust in what I'm reading and what I'm learning. And that's it.
That's a
Thank you for
lot.
sharing that. It's, I hadn't really picked up on that before, actually, that Rebecca is Betula, which means a young woman or a maiden, sometimes translated as virgin, but that's a assumption that a maiden would be. So Betuel, are we meant to understand that her father had her quite young, and had children as a young lad, or like how do we understand that wordplay then?
I like to think of it that there was a tradition in that family among at least Rebecca and maybe others, maybe people who lived around there. And so they followed the tradition of, in biblical terms, not knowing a man before they found their mate. Now, okay, there's one other thing I'd like to mention. A young woman of marriageable age, the word is alma, little different word. And if we look at Isaiah 7:14, for example, it says Alma. It does not say Betula. If I looked at the Septuagint is known as the LXX. LXX is Roman numerals for 70. That's the one where we believe that it's written in Greek, by the way. That's the one, oh, they sent the 72 rabbis or 70 rabbis. Each one goes in a room, and they translated the Hebrew into Greek. And the mythology is they all came out and it was identical word for word. Now, here's the problem. When I look at the Septuagint in Greek, I can read the words. I'm not fluent in Greek. I'm not that kind of scholar, but I can manage the words. And the word is parthenos. Parthenos is the Greek word meaning virgin, whereas the Hebrew doesn't say virgin, doesn't say Betula. It says Alma. So that's just our tradition. I think I can put the Greek in the chat if anyone wants to look it over, maybe for later, whatever. Check. You can fact check me, make sure I know what I'm doing.
I don't know any Greek, so it's all Greek to me. But I guess my question meant more like, how do we understand, as you said, names in the Bible are often meant to communicate something essential about their being, right? Like Ruth's children's names are, not Ruth, Naomi's children's names are sickness and famine, like, and then they die, you know? So what does it mean that, is there, first of all, in English, do we have a like male equivalent of like how we understand maiden? Is it just a young boy? Like, how would we translate that? And then if, and so then once we determine what that means, this like masculine version of maiden, right? Betula, Betuel, what does that tell us about Rebecca's father?
I think someplace in all that knowledge Joel just passed on, I think he said something about that maybe it was a family tradition to separate that family from what was going on in the area around, that they did hold themselves until marriage. And maybe the name was indicating that, but I think that's what I understood Joel to say.
Okay. There was a lot.
We need Joel translations.
Yeah.
Okay, about Betuel. Betuel is mentioned 7 times in the 5 books of Moses. Okay, and I've been going through it piece by piece. And when I'm stuck, I always have much more success in the Hebrew than I do in the English, because our language, the Hebrew language, is an inflective language, and it's so clear. And when we get into translation by the language, when we translate, to translate means to interpret. Like I can take something, I'm just gonna lay my own interpretation onto it. I can't help it. And that's one of the downfalls. And there's an Italian phrase, traditori tradutore, that translators will often use. These are people who maybe they're going to offer their services. Maybe I need a letter written in Spanish. I can send it to them. I give them $20 and they'll turn it into a nice Spanish letter. But it's known among translators that to translate is to be a traitor. Like many times you just can't find the exact word that fits both languages. Just, you can't do it.
Right. Which is why we caution people who can only read texts in translation, which is most of us if we're looking at ancient texts. I mean, so, but every translation is an interpretation, and there's never going to be an exact one for one. And even the scholars, right? That like you can know standard Hebrew or biblical Hebrew like the back of your hand, but then we get the hapexonomicons. Did I say that right? Legomenon. That, that's a word that only appears once, right? And so you don't actually know what it is because there's nothing else to compare it to. It's an ancient word that appears to have died out. And you have like no, Rosetta Stone kind of situation to help decipher it. I mean, you may be like by context or whatever, but
have the people here heard the word Targum? Targum? No? Anyway, of course, Rabbi Goldstein and I know that we have Targum Onkelos, we have Targum Jonathan. What these are, this is commentary on the Bible that was written in Aramaic, a different language.
Right.
The
It's
reason
sort of
being,
the Aramaic version of the Septuagint. Like for the most part, they're translations, but then again, like then you have those distinctions in words. So like a mikra ot gedolo, like they make these books that the pagination is sort of set up like, you know, a Talmud page. So the center will have the Hebrew text, the Torah, and sometimes like I have one JPS put out that's the Hebrew and then the current JPS translation by its side. And then, you know, and then the classic commentaries, Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra. I don't know, you know, the standard ones will kind of be on the side and across the bottom and whatever, and give the more what we think of as commentary, you know, the midrash, the explanations, the like, you know, adding on. And then at the top corner will be the Targum. And those will mostly be, you'll see it's a translation. It's not an explanation of the text. It's like it's still the text, but it will point out what the word differences are between, you know, the Hebrew and the Aramaic and how things get lost in translation. And Onkelos did sometimes also add things because he was a convert. So he had a different understanding sometimes that he would bring his genius to, you know, as we see sometimes people who come from the outside, so to speak, have a healthy, fresh take. Like Akiva. I mean, he was not a convert, but he didn't know he didn't know how to read or write or Torah until he was old, and then he became like the greatest midrashist. So, my cat is snoring.
It's a good day for it.
It is. Okay. Well, all right. So back to the Parsha though. We got about 15 minutes left. Other thoughts or commentary on what's going on here? By the way, the Haftarah this week, you know, we had a lot to say about King David on Sunday. The Haftarah this week comes from the beginning of Kings when David is old and about to die, and he can't seem to, you know, as sometimes happens with old people, you know, his circulation is not good. He can't seem to get warm. So they bring a betula, I believe is the word they use. Yep, a betula to his bed. And it's nothing sexual, which is kind of surprising for King David, as we learned on Sunday, but he's, you know, he's too old at this point, I guess. So he just lies in bed with him. They just like lie naked together to try to like warm him up and like get his blood moving. And it's still yeah. So that's
So is that supposed to be a comparison of not Rebecca and Isaac? I would guess it's talking about Abraham's remarriage. Is that the comparison, or is there something deeper here that?
to me, well, okay, so I think there's two things happening. Then it goes on the I guess you could still call it a parsha. Parsha means like segment. But the rest of this Haftarah portion then gets into some of the inherit, because then David does die in that first chapter when the Betula fails to warm his bed sufficiently. And so then there's like a power struggle of the children and who will inherit. So I think that's meant, that the Torah, I think that's the intended connection. I'm sure we could find somewhere some authoritative explanation, but I think it's that because Abraham dies as well, and it says these are all his children that he leaves behind, but he gives everything to Isaac. Unfortunately, in their case, there isn't a war. I mean, Abraham's also not king, so I guess it's like less worth fighting over, but there doesn't seem to be much power struggle over the inheritance in Isaac's case, whereas of course, in David's case, there is a war and all of the brothers fight each other, except for Solomon doesn't seem to really go into battle. I think he's still quite young, even though it's determined he will be the heir. But the other brothers have a bloody battle and there's some weird deaths. The hair. Yeah. So, but I do think, I don't know, I think it's not insignificant that that word appears again right at the beginning, Betula, even though I don't think that's like the intended hook to this week's Torah portion, but since we've talked about that word, I wanted to share that. Okay, well, that's all we got. We can always end 10 minutes early. Next week we will continue with Parashat Toldot, Genesis 25:19 through 28:9. Fun fact, twice I have done twin bar mitzvahs for this parsha. Both families claimed it wasn't intentional, that they just like had November birthdays and it was the appropriate Shabbat for their b'nai mitzvah. But it's always interesting to watch twins, and both cases were twin boys. They were both fraternal, but same gender, twin boys. That interesting to see them sort of find themselves in the text. This one's so much more like his mother, and this one's so much more like his father, and very interesting. So we will discuss that some more next week. All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Have a
Thank you.
good
Thank
week.
you.
Nice
And
Bye.
if you
Yes,
want to join us
next week.
Sunday, we're going to discuss Psalms this week on Sunday at 1. Okay. Bye.